Pre-dawn. Somewhere west of the Russian capital, a security guard at one of Russia's largest fuel processing complexes lights a cigarette and checks his watch. He hears nothing unusual. The night is still. The perimeter lights are steady. And then, from the southwest, something changes in the texture of the darkness. A faint electric hum, barely distinguishable from the wind, growing not louder, but more present, more deliberate, more inevitable. He looks up. By the time he reaches for his radio, the first drone is already on final approach. This is the story of how Ukraine reached inside Russia's defensive perimeter, struck a fuel complex close enough to Moscow that the fireball painted the horizon orange for 3 hours, and sent a political shockwave through the Kremlin that no air defense system could intercept. I'm your host at ConflictEast, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we're going deep. The planning, the execution, the destruction, and the consequences of one of the most audacious long-range strikes of the entire conflict. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next 27 minutes rewrites everything Russia believed about strategic depth. To understand why this strike mattered, you first have to understand what the target was. Russia's war machine runs on fuel. Not metaphorically, literally. Every T-72 tank that rolls toward a Ukrainian tree line burns diesel. Every Su-35 fighter that climbs to intercept a Ukrainian drone burns jet fuel. Every Iskander missile transporter that repositions under cover of darkness burns fuel. The logistics chain of a modern mechanized army is, at its core, a chain of combustion. And Ukraine's intelligence services had spent months mapping exactly where that chain was most vulnerable. The complex in question was not some minor provincial depot. This was a primary processing installation, one of the largest in the western half of Russia, feeding refined petroleum products outward through a network of rail connections and pipeline taps that reached military logistics hubs across the Voronezh, Kursk, and Belgorod oblasts. Ukrainian General Staff analysts, working with satellite imagery and signals intelligence from Western partners, had identified this facility as a Tier 1 strategic target. Not because destroying it would immediately stop Russian tanks, but because damaging it would force Russia to reroute fuel supply from alternative sources further east, adding time, cost, and complexity to an already strained logistics apparatus. The strike was not improvised. It was the product of planning that stretched back weeks, involving reconnaissance drone overflights at high altitude, electronic signature mapping of the facility's air defense assets, and careful study of Russian radar coverage gaps in the region west of the capital. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The drone package assembled for this mission represented a new generation of Ukrainian long-range capability. At its core were modified variants of the Lyuti, the indigenous Ukrainian long-range strike drone that engineers had been steadily refining through iterative combat testing. These were not the earliest versions, which had achieved impressive range but modest precision. The drones committed to this mission carried upgraded navigation packages combining inertial guidance with optical terminal homing. Even in environments where Russian GPS jamming was active, the weapons could lock onto the thermal and visual signature of their target during the final approach and correct course autonomously. The package consisted of 12 primary strike drones, each carrying a warhead optimized for industrial infrastructure, shaped to maximize fire initiation rather than simple blast radius. 4 additional drones carried electronic countermeasures payloads, designed to confuse Russian radar systems during the penetration phase by emitting false returns and fragmenting the coherent picture that ground-based air defense operators would see on their screens. The entire package was coordinated to arrive within a 7-minute window, with the ECM drones preceding the strike elements by approximately 4 minutes. The launch point was deep inside Ukrainian-controlled territory. The drones flew outbound at low altitude, between 40 and 80 meters above the terrain. For the majority of their flight, hugging river valleys and exploiting terrain masking to stay below the effective floor of Russia's longer-range radar systems. This phase of the mission lasted several hours, the drones threading their way northeast through the darkness on pre-programmed waypoints refined using radar coverage data obtained through Western intelligence sharing. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? The drones themselves? The electronic warfare packages that blinded Russian defenses? Or the intelligence infrastructure that made the targeting possible? Comment A for the strike drones, B for the ECM package, C for the intelligence network. Answer at the end. Approximately 140 kilometers from the target, the package entered the most dangerous phase of the flight, the outer ring of Russian air defense coverage associated with the capital's defensive layering. This was not the dense integrated network that protects Moscow's inner zones. Those were too heavily defended to penetrate cost-effectively. But it was not empty sky either. Russian Panzer S-1 systems were positioned at intervals along likely approach corridors, and longer-range S-300 batteries provided coverage from elevated ground positions that extended radar reach. Here is where the first obstacle emerged. 3 of the ECM drones experienced navigation drift during a phase of the flight where Russian GPS spoofing signals were particularly intense, pushing false position data into their guidance systems. 2 of the 3 recovered using their inertial backup reference. The third deviated from its planned waypoint by several kilometers and had to be evaluated remotely. Was it still functional? Could it rejoin the package in time to contribute to the defense suppression role it had been assigned? The operators, monitoring from a secure ground station inside Ukraine, made the call within 90 seconds. They rerouted the drifted drone onto a modified waypoint that would bring it to the target zone from a slightly different angle. Not optimal, but functional. The strike timeline held. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes destroys a fuel complex the size of a small city. The Russian air defense operators on duty in that sector that night were not incompetent. That needs to be said plainly. The Russian Federation has invested enormous resources in air defense, and the personnel manning those systems are trained to a real standard. The problem they faced was not a failure of individual competence. It was a failure of the system's design assumptions. Russian air defense architecture, even in the layered zones around the capital region, is built around the assumption that threats approach from specific directions along predictable corridors. The legacy of Cold War doctrine designed to defeat NATO cruise missiles launched from known naval or air launch platforms. The Ukrainian drones did not approach from those corridors. They came from the southwest, threading a gap between 2 radar coverage zones at an altitude and speed profile that fell into a blind spot between the floor coverage of the longer-range systems and the practical detection range of the shorter-range point defense assets. By the time a Panzer S-1 crew approximately 60 kilometers from the target acquired radar contact on what their system initially categorized as a possible flock of large birds, the algorithm hesitated on the signature. The strike package was already committed to final approach. The crew reclassified, opened fire. 3 missiles launched. 1 drone was struck and disabled. It fell into an agricultural field and detonated harmlessly. The remaining 11 strike drones were already past the engagement envelope. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happens next is a masterclass in precision strike planning. The refinery complex was not a single building. It was a sprawling industrial installation covering several square kilometers, with a central processing area containing distillation columns and cracking units, surrounding tank farms holding hundreds of thousands of tons of refined and semi-refined product, a rail loading terminal on its eastern edge, and administrative and maintenance infrastructure distributed across the site. The perimeter was lit by industrial floodlights. The processing towers were illuminated by their own operational lighting. From altitude, had anyone been watching from altitude, the facility would have appeared as a brilliant pool of light set against the dark Russian countryside. The Ukrainian targeting selection had been precise. Not the tank farms. Those would produce spectacular fires, but their destruction primarily represented product loss, which Russia could replace. The primary targets were the distillation and cracking units themselves, the industrial heart of the facility where crude petroleum was transformed into the specific refined products the Russian military needed. Destroy those processing units, and even if the tanks remained full, the output chain was severed. Secondary targets were the rail loading infrastructure, the gantries and pumping systems that moved product from the facility into the rail tanker cars that fed the military logistics network eastward. The terminal guidance phase began. Each of the 11 surviving strike drones acquired its assigned aim point independently using the thermal imaging of the processing towers, hot with industrial heat even at this hour, as the locking reference. The optical seeker heads in each drone tracked, confirmed, and finalized. At 3:17 a.m., the first drone impacted the primary distillation column. The explosion was not the massive fireball that would come later. The initial strike was a penetrating detonation, the shaped warhead driving into the column structure and rupturing the pressurized internal system. Superheated fluid and vapor jetted from the breach. Then, approximately 4 seconds later, the ignition. The column became a torch. 11 seconds after the first impact, the second drone struck an adjacent processing unit. The third hit the primary cracking reactor housing. The fourth and fifth struck in close succession on the rail loading gantry on the eastern side of the complex. By the time the sixth drone reached its aim point, the entire processing area was engulfed in a conflagration that lit the sky for kilometers in every direction. Russian air defense systems in the vicinity began firing. They fired at drones that were already gone, already spent, the warheads already delivered. Missiles streaked upward into empty sky, seeking targets that no longer existed. The radar operators, their screens saturated with the infrared bloom of the burning facility, were effectively blinded. Their systems were designed to track aircraft and missiles, not to manage the aftermath of a strike that had already completed. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed in the hours that followed that the primary processing infrastructure, the distillation columns and cracking units, sustained catastrophic structural damage. At least 3 of the 5 primary processing towers were destroyed outright. The rail loading terminal was rendered inoperable. The conflagration reached the outer edge of one tank farm and ignited several storage tanks there, adding to a fire that would burn for more than 16 hours, despite emergency firefighting resources deployed from multiple surrounding districts. If you believe tactics win wars, type ConflictEast in the comments. Now let's talk about what the Russian government did in the hours after the strike, because this is where the story gets politically interesting. The initial official Russian response was silence, not denial. Not acknowledgement, silence. The state media apparatus, which had spent months building a narrative around the impenetrability of Russian strategic depth. The idea that the war was something happening far away, on a distant frontier, not something that could reach inside Russia itself, went dark on the story for several hours. Local Telegram channels near the facility began posting videos almost immediately. The glow visible from suburban areas, emergency vehicle convoys moving toward the smoke, residents photographing the orange horizon from apartment balconies. The videos spread. They couldn't be contained. The infrastructure of social information had made the old Soviet tools of suppression obsolete. When the official acknowledgement finally came, it was carefully framed. The Ministry of Defense confirmed that Ukrainian drones had struck a civilian industrial facility and caused fires, which were being managed by emergency services. Ukraine, the aggressor, striking civilian infrastructure. The same framing Russia applies to every strike, regardless of whether the target has military function. This is where we need to apply some analytical rigor. Here's the ConflictEast assessment. A fuel refinery documented to supply refined petroleum products to military logistics networks is not, under any reasonable reading of the laws of armed conflict, a protected civilian object. It is a dual-use infrastructure target with direct military supply function. Ukraine striking it is categorically different from Russia striking Ukrainian residential apartment blocks, hospitals, and civilian energy infrastructure serving no military purpose, which Russia has done systematically throughout the conflict. Russia bombs cities. Ukraine strikes fuel refineries, feeding the military machine that is doing the bombing. These are not equivalent actions. What would NATO have done differently? Could the alliance have interdicted this supply chain through alternative means? Economic pressure? Financial sanctions on the operating companies? Diplomatic channels? Or is kinetic strike the only tool that produces real disruption? Comment your analysis. The aftermath assessment, compiled from satellite imagery, open-source verification, and Ukrainian general staff reporting, indicated significant damage to the refinery's processing capacity. Analysts estimated the facility would require a minimum of several months to restore even partial processing function, and full restoration would depend on access to specialized industrial equipment, some of which Russia has difficulty obtaining under current sanctions regimes. The second obstacle emerged in the strike's aftermath. Ukrainian drone operators reviewing mission telemetry identified that one strike drone had not reached its designated aim point. Telemetry logs showed it had been damaged, probably by debris from an earlier explosion at the facility rather than by Russian defensive fire, and had impacted approximately 200 meters from its intended target, a secondary processing unit that had therefore received only minor damage from the concussive effects of adjacent strikes rather than a direct hit. The assessment was that the secondary processing unit remained partially functional. The question was immediately raised inside Ukrainian targeting authorities. Was a second wave warranted? Could additional assets be committed to finish the job? The answer, ultimately, was not immediately. The operational security calculus had shifted. Russia now knew the approach corridor. The Pantsir S-1 crew that had engaged the package would report the trajectory. Russian defense planners would work through the night to reinforce coverage of the gap that had been exploited. A follow-on strike in the near term would face a more prepared defense. Better to hold the option, allow Russian attention to be drawn elsewhere, and revisit when conditions were more favorable. This is tactical patience, one of the least glamorous and most important skills in modern warfare. The ability to accept an 85% outcome and not overreach for the final 15% at disproportionate cost. That requires discipline. The processing unit that survived would become relevant again, but not yet. Because first, we need to understand what this strike actually changed, and whether the Russian fuel supply problem it was designed to create actually materialized. In the weeks following the strike, Ukrainian intelligence analysis corroborated by satellite observation of Russian military logistics movements detected indicators consistent with increased fuel transit activity on rail lines running east from the Ural region toward the theater of operations. This was interpreted as Russia compensating for the disrupted Western supply by routing more product from Eastern production sources. A longer, more expensive, more logistically complex pipeline. Longer pipelines mean more vulnerability. More rail movements mean more targets. Ukraine's strike had not severed the fuel supply. It had stretched it, forced it into shapes that introduced new weaknesses. This is how modern strategic targeting works. The goal is rarely total destruction. Total destruction is usually unachievable, and trying to achieve it wastes resources. The goal is disruption. Force the adversary to operate outside their optimized logistics architecture, introduce friction, cost them time and money, expose new vulnerabilities for future exploitation. The strike achieved this, measurably. Ukrainian HIMARS units in the Zaporizhzhia sector reported, in the weeks following the refinery strike, a detectable reduction in the intensity of Russian artillery activity in their area of operations. Not a collapse, not a cessation, but a measurable reduction that field commanders assessed as consistent with ammunition and fuel constraints at forward positions. Correlation is not causation, but the timing was notable. Russian armored activity in the Donetsk sector showed similar patterns. A slight but consistent reduction in the frequency of assault operations that analysts connected, at least partially, to fuel supply constraints affecting forward unit readiness. The refinery was not the only variable. The conflict is too complex, too multidimensional, to attribute any single tactical development to any single strike. But the strike contributed to a cumulative pressure that was visible in Russian operational patterns. This is what Ukraine understood, and what Russia's strategic planners failed to adequately account for. The cumulative effect of repeated infrastructure strikes, each individually insufficient to produce decisive results, collectively degrading the system below the threshold of efficient function. Now let's address the air defense question directly, because it matters most in terms of what this strike means for the future. Russia has invested enormously in layered air defense. The S-400 system is genuinely capable. The Panzer S one-point defense is functional. The integrated air defense architecture around Moscow has been described by Russian military officials as the most dense in the world, and a package of 12 drones penetrated it. How? The answer is not that Russian air defense is incompetent. The answer is that no air defense system, regardless of cost or sophistication, can defend against a threat it cannot see early enough to engage. The Ukrainian drones exploited the fundamental physical limitation of radar. It requires line of sight, and terrain masks line of sight. Flying at 40 meters above a river valley, a small drone with a modest radar cross-section is essentially invisible to any radar system that cannot position itself below the drone's altitude, which ground-based systems cannot do. The solution to this problem, from a defensive standpoint, is layered low-altitude coverage using systems specifically designed for very low-level detection. Aerostat-mounted radars, low-altitude gap filler systems, sensor networks that can share data to reconstruct a complete low-altitude picture. Russia has some of these capabilities. It does not have enough of them, distributed densely enough to close the coverage gaps that exist in the hundreds of kilometers of potential approach routes to any given target. Ukraine has exploited this limitation methodically. The Deep Strike program has not been a series of random attacks. It has been a systematic effort to map, test, probe, and exploit specific gaps in Russian coverage, learning from each penetration attempt, successful or not, to refine understanding of where the holes are and how to thread through them. Drone operators who execute these missions are not button pushers following a script. They are analysts, problem solvers, modern practitioners of an art form that didn't exist a decade ago. Their accumulated operational knowledge. The understanding of how Russian systems behave under specific jamming conditions, how radar operators respond to specific signature profiles, where the physical terrain creates usable shadow, represents a strategic asset that cannot be captured in a simple equipment count. Is this the future of warfare? The replacement of expensive manned platforms with cheap autonomous ones? Comment yes or no. Will drone swarms make conventional air forces obsolete within 15 years? The political dimension of this strike deserves separate treatment because it operated on a different level from the purely military one. Russia's domestic political management of the war has depended, in significant part, on maintaining the perception that the conflict is distant, that it happens on the frontier, in contested territories, not in Russia proper. The Kremlin's media apparatus has worked systematically to sustain this impression, because the alternative, the acknowledgement that the war is coming home, creates political pressure that the regime cannot easily manage. A burning fuel refinery visible from suburban Moscow does not support that impression. The orange glow that residents photographed from apartment windows represented something more dangerous to the Kremlin than the physical damage to the facility. It was visible evidence that strategic depth is not what it was claimed to be, that the war can reach inward, that the promise of a protective buffer between the conflict and Russian civilian life is not guaranteed. This is information warfare conducted through kinetic means. Ukraine didn't just strike a refinery. Ukraine delivered a message to the Russian population that their government's narrative of controlled, distant war was not the complete picture. Whether that message translates into meaningful political pressure inside Russia is a separate question, one that depends on variables of political sociology that military analysis alone cannot resolve. What can be said is that repeated strikes of this kind, each one extending the visible geography of the conflict inward toward the Russian heartland, accumulate psychological and political effects that complement the direct material damage. Now let's deliver the tactical summary and close out this analysis. The strike succeeded by the primary metric. The target's processing capacity was severely degraded. The fuel supply chain feeding Russian military logistics in the Western theater was disrupted, and the operational cost, 12 strike drones plus 4 ECM systems, was substantially lower than the value of what was destroyed. The secondary metric, the political and psychological effect of reaching this close to Moscow, was also achieved, arguably beyond the planners' expectations, given the scale of visible public awareness generated by the event. The residual partial functionality of one secondary processing unit represents an unfinished element that will presumably be addressed in future strike planning. The obstacle encountered during the mission, GPS spoofing causing navigation drift in 3 ECM drones, was managed through real-time operator intervention, demonstrating both the flexibility of Ukraine's strike coordination and the importance of maintaining human override capability in autonomous systems. Now, the answer to our earlier question. How many primary processing units did Ukraine destroy in this strike? The answer is C. 5 primary processing towers were targeted, and at least 3 were destroyed outright, with a 4th sustaining severe damage. The 5th sustained only moderate damage due to the navigation deviation that caused 1 strike drone to miss its aim point. 3 confirmed destroyed, 1 severely damaged, 1 partially damaged out of 5 targeted. A strike effectiveness rate that military analysts would assess as above average for a long-range autonomous strike package operating against a defended target with active jamming. 3 questions for your reflection, and we want real answers in the comments. Was committing 12 strike drones to a single facility, instead of distributing the same assets across 3 or 4 smaller targets simultaneously, the right tactical choice? Does concentration of effort produce better results than distribution when the goal is infrastructure disruption? Could Russia have prevented this strike? Not with better tactics on the night in question, but with different investment decisions over the preceding years? More low-altitude gap-filler radar systems? More Panzer S-1 units in the Western approach sectors? Or is the attack surface simply too large for any finite defensive investment to close all the gaps? And the most important question, what would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian commander responsible for this operation? Would you have committed more assets for higher confidence? Fewer assets for a less detectable package? Targeted different systems within the facility? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments. We read every one. Subscribe to ConflictEast, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast. The refinery site is quieter now. Emergency services have contained the fires. Russian engineers are assessing what can be salvaged and what must be rebuilt. The processing towers that burned stand as twisted industrial sculpture, monuments to the gap between the story Russia told its people about strategic invulnerability and the physical reality that drones exploited in the pre-dawn hours. Modern warfare punishes the gap between narrative and reality without mercy. The next strike is already being planned. Somewhere, in a secure facility inside Ukraine, analysts are reviewing satellite imagery, mapping radar coverage patterns, refining waypoint calculations. The lesson of this operation, that gaps exist, that they can be found, that they can be threaded, has been absorbed and will be applied. Stay vigilant.